Alain's presentation today is on Canadian multinational enterprises entrepreneurship in China. His presentation will be followed by a question and answer period. Without further ado, I'll turn the podium to Alain.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to be here and to give you a short introduction to the paper, which has a difficult title, Multinational Enterprise Subsidiary Entrepreneurship in China, the distinctive roles of Slack and subsidiary capabilities, that I co-authored with two people, in particular my colleague Wenlong Yuan, who did most of the empirical work for the study. In fact, it's a difficult title, but the subject is very simple. The subject is really to what extent are Canadian affiliates in China entrepreneurial, or to what extent do they just, do some stuff that the headquarters tells them to do. Now, when we think about Canada-China relationships, we of course very often think about the macro picture, and we think about high-level government interactions, we think about infrastructure developments, we think about things like gateways, exchange rates problems. And all these issues are, of course, very important, but what I focus on is really what firms actually do and the problems that they encounter. Now, with respect to the emerging economy context of China, we all know, of course, the tremendous macro-level growth over the past 20 years of more than 9%. And of course, what is interesting is, I'll come back to my survey, or our survey extensively, but it's clear that about 2/3 of Canadian companies that are active in China, that they say that they want to really take advantage of that growing market. So it's really about taking advantage of that market in China. And now that is important because that creates a problem that we'll come back to immediately. There's, of course, a lot of industry change in China. There's lots of uncertainty, and we all know that there are still problems with respect to the consistent implementation of regulations, with respect to environmental laws, with respect to contract enforcement, and so on. And then the reality, of course, is when you talk to managers, the Chinese environment is still very much a high-distance environment. High institutional distance, high economic distance, high cultural distance, of course. Now, again, I will talk extensively about the empirical work we did, but perhaps two preliminary points. The first point is that many of the subsidiaries actually do have somewhat weaker capabilities when compared to what I would call the lower distance rivals operating in China, meaning subsidiaries of multinational firms but actually come from Asian countries. So you think, for example, about a firm like EHC, that EHC Global, that makes elevators and kind of railings and so on, handrails. So that firm, for example, has to compete with a Japanese company like Hitachi. And so that's a firm that is at a disadvantage in terms of the strength of its capabilities in China. And there are many examples. Nortel is another example that has to, or that has had to compete with much stronger rivals, in fact, from Asian countries. The second point is that actually most of the subsidiaries that were set up there, whether in the context of joint ventures or wholly owned subsidiaries, were there mainly to exploit their, what I would call, extant parent company capabilities, which really means the parent company transfers the specs, if you want, and then the subsidiary is supposed to implement exactly what the parent does. But you already see a little bit, and then that is in fact one of the main storylines of the talk today. You see already a little bit of contradiction. On the one hand, with respect to that first point, substantial macro level growth. So Canadian firms want to take advantage of that. They want to build upon that. They want to grow a business. And on the other hand, the subsidiaries then are supposed mainly to exploit efficiently those extant parent company capabilities. Well, that is a problem, of course, because probably what the Chinese market needs and wants is something that needs to be adapted. It's probably not exactly what the Canadian specs suggest. But I will come back to that extensively. Of course, the reality is that in a number of cases that we did identify, there are these so-called added responsibilities that subsidiaries get. So in other words, the subsidiaries develop some initiatives beyond the charter that they receive from the head office. So they move beyond the simple exploitation of those extant parent company capabilities. And ultimately, then what happens, or what should happen, if we're serious about this, is that there should be so-called subsidiary initiatives. There should be entrepreneurship shown in these subsidiaries. In that context, perhaps it's also useful to mention, to say something about who actually runs these subsidiaries, because of course we have this tendency of saying, well, are they Canadians or not? Well, it's a bit more complex than that, of course. Two-thirds of the subsidiaries that we talk to are actually run by Chinese individuals, but those include many people who actually were in Canada for a while and then emigrated back to China. So there are quite a number of those. So I think when you say, this subsidiary is run by a Chinese manager, you have to be careful, because actually not only may that Chinese manager actually have the Canadian nationality, but we actually have spent many years studying, working in Canada. And only 1/4 to up to 1/3 are actually subsidiaries that are run by a Canadian-born CEO. Now, the intellectually kind of interesting question that we asked, and that is really the focus of the paper, is, well, assuming now that Canadian parent companies, or some Canadian parent companies, would like to have more entrepreneurship in the Chinese subsidiaries, then what exactly should be done? So even if in a first stage you have basically set up a subsidiary there that is supposed to be nothing more than an export platform, or nothing more than a subsidiary, an affiliate that simply has to produce according to specs and then see if anyone wants that in China, whatever is being produced to these specs. So even if you've started like that, how can you now actually take advantage of that growing local market and that dynamic environment? Is it more money that you need? Is it purely a question of, we have to give them more financial resources? Is it more human resources? Like, do we have to give them good expatriates that have like a deep knowledge of how the firm works and how things can perhaps be done better in China? Is it about access to financing? So it's not so financial resources, here's the check. Access to financing means that you get, for example, particular credit lines with financial institutions, or that you facilitate access, you give some guarantees as a parent company. Or is the question of strengthening of capabilities? So do these subsidiaries need more knowledge, or is it something else? So that is really the intellectual question, if you want, that we try to answer in the paper. Now, what are the answers to that from established scholarly work? There is actually a lot of scholarly work in international business, in strategy, in the entrepreneurship literature on what drives subsidiary initiatives. We have a former Canadian doctoral student at the Ivy Business School, for example, Julian Birkinshaw, who is now a professor at the London Business School, who did tremendous work on subsidiary initiatives. There are actually a number of people in Canada who do work on this topic, including myself. Much of this work has to do with developed economies, though. And so what we find from that literature, and then we'll try to assess whether actually that also holds for an emerging economy context like China, but what we conclude from that literature on developed economies is, yes, indeed, if there are a number of organizational actions through which we can actually foster entrepreneurship. More money certainly helps. I will come back to this because it's a bit more complex story. More human resources, such as expatriates, that helps certainly too, because expatriates, in fact, what they do is they're kind of a translator. So the moment that the subsidiary starts to deviate from the charter, the expatriate can actually explain this to the head office. The expatriate is usually a trusted person with a lot of experience in the company, and so there can be a kind of a dialogue between the subsidiary and the head office. We also know that, yes, if the parent company facilitates subsidiaries' access to funds, whether it's from the head office or external economic actors like financial institutions, it doesn't matter, that also helps. And finally, we know that if you strengthen subsidiary capabilities, so if you say, well, you're going to be allowed to do R&D, that obviously also helps as compared to a situation where you say, well, no, you can't do R&D, you're just there to produce. So if you allow some capabilities to grow, to flourish, that actually happens. So that's very often a mental game that occurs in a multinational firm. We also know from the past literature that if you are in a dynamic host country environment, so there's lots going on, there is a cluster, there are very dynamic suppliers, dynamic buyers, all the actors push each other to be innovative, that also has, of course, an impact on, or it amplifies the effects of the organizational actions. It amplifies all those good things that come, for example, from more financial resources or more human resources. And we also know that a hostile, that's perhaps an inappropriate word, but a hostile environment can sometimes also be good. Hostile means that there is actually a lot of direct competition with other firms that are in the same niches as yourself. That type of competition seems also to foster innovation. And that makes sense, of course, because if you're in a very hostile environment where you have a number of competitors that provide almost the same products and services as yourself, then obviously the only way you can avoid coming into a commodity market where basically the customers only try to get you on price, the only way to escape from that, of course, is through some innovation in terms of service or product delivery. Now, of course, as I mentioned, all this extant scholarly work was tested and validated mainly in the context of developed economies. Is this now also valid in an emerging economy such as China? And you see here, of course, a picture of Vancouver, the developed economy context, and there's a picture of a trade fair in China. And the question is, does this past research have any relevance? So what I want to talk then about very concretely is a little bit about the roles of subsidiaries and initiatives. Then I'll talk about the drivers of subsidiary initiatives, and a big concept here today is in the paper is the concept of slack resources. I'll talk a little bit about the research methodology that we used in the empirical work, and then finally the findings and discussions, the discussion on the basis of kind of these managers of Chinese subsidiaries, what they felt they needed, what they felt their problems were in terms of being able to become more entrepreneurial. Okay, so now conventionally I would say until the 1980s, early 1980s, and I know there are many exceptions, but I think that the common knowledge or the common idea was that really subsidiaries are mainly instrumental to their parent companies, and they have largely passive roles. It's not that you can not have an occasional entrepreneur, but it's really very much directed by the head office. It's very much what we call in the strategy literature induced projects. And it's a little bit what you see there on the right-hand side. So there is behind the desk the principal. The principal says to the employee, your opinions are a rephrasing of my opinions. I like that in a subordinate. The more recent insight is that actually, in the more recent insight, that means the past 25 years really, is that subsidiaries have new roles, sometimes very sophisticated new roles that may involve entrepreneurial initiatives and unique capabilities. And that really means ultimately that you deviate from your original charter and you're not punished for it. So ultimately what it means in concrete business terms is that there's growth and there are profits, but not in areas that were originally contemplated by the head office in the parent company. So what that means, to put it in different terms, is that subsidiaries then become what you could call heterogeneous bundles of subsidiary capabilities. And when I use the word heterogeneous, I mean different from what already exists, either in the parent company or elsewhere in the multinational enterprise. So when we use the word subsidiary capabilities, really what we are referring to is something that is unique inside the firm. In this case, it would mean something that is specific to China, something that is strong in this Chinese subsidiary, and that we really don't have anywhere else. And it's clear that subsidiary capabilities and subsidiary entrepreneurial initiatives, that they really reinforce each other. But the point is that there is this focus on these specialized resources that are not available elsewhere in the company. Now, when we did this research, it became clear very quickly that there is perhaps something missing. And the question that we asked is it really only the quality of the firm's resources that counts, the capabilities? Or is there also something that is important in the context of quantity, and quantity in terms of slack? And I'll come back to that concept extensively. And then to the extent that slack is important, is there then a linkage with the environment? And is there a linkage then with the quality of the capabilities itself? So you see there, that's perhaps not very clear, but the conventional stories, you see that scale there, on the right-hand side, you see that little gold ball. It's heavy. It's it weighs. It's important. That's the capability. That's the thing that makes you unique. And there you see on the left-hand side, it's really the quantity of resources that you have, like the quantity of people that you have that can actually do things. And so most of the past scholarly literature has focused a lot on the quality of those capabilities. And not that I have a problem with that, because of course if you have no quality, there's not going to be much sales and growth and profitability. But I think that somehow, very often, that left-hand side there of the scale is kind of underestimated. So let's talk a little bit about Slack as a driver of subsidiary initiatives. So you see here on the right-hand side again 2 pictures, just to visualize how we conceptualize Slack. At the top there, you see this manager who is completely overburdened, overwhelmed with paperwork. Perhaps today it would not be paper; it would just be 500 emails a day that come in, and you basically have absolutely no time to deal with anything else. At the bottom there, you see the person who is on the clean desk and who is reflecting in, I think, a kind of a Buddhist way, and is basically, thinking about how can we have better or more service delivery to the customer. And so Slack really reflects resources that are not fully utilized. And it's really the quantity of resources above and beyond present resource demand. How we operationalize that in the research, I will tell you in a few minutes. But the point is that if you have Slack, you can actually use that for experimentation. You can actually allow people to do something that is, above and beyond their normal work. At 3M, a company that is, of course, has been very well known for decades for its innovative capacity. At 3M, they talk about skunk work projects, for example. And so the point is that every employee who is at a particular level and is perceived to have the capability to actually do something innovative is getting time and perhaps even some resources to be innovative. And there is, in the scholarly world, there is a long tradition building upon the behavioral theory of the firm, Sart and March, the whole Carnegie school that basically builds upon that concept. And that whole literature, and I just mentioned that one reference, but there's a whole literature that shows that indeed Slack can be tremendously important, also in a domestic context, to entrepreneurship. So what will appear to be the most important concept or the most important parameter in the study, and I can say that with hindsight, is actually human resources Slack. Those are the knowledge and the skills embedded in the employees that can typically be deployed across various activities in the firm. And so I will come back to this again, but so you could ask people, you could ask the manager, you could ask individuals in the company, assume that due to some sudden development, 10% of the time of all people working in the subsidiary has to be spent on work totally unconnected to their current tasks and responsibilities. How seriously will your performance be affected over the next year? And then, as we'll see later, you basically can give an answer on a scale of 1 to 10, whereby on the one extreme you have, this will have no effect whatsoever on our performance, no problem. We could actually do that, which means that you have probably substantial slack in the organization, versus, if we do that, it's going to be a catastrophe. So our, production, for example, is going to go down by 20% if we had to basically, take our employees away for 10% of the time. So that means that you have zero slack. You have no slack whatsoever. So I'll come back to what then that means later. Perhaps just one additional conceptual point. The literature suggests that when you then have human resources slack, that basically then it's a little bit sticky. So assuming that you have that human resources slack, so people can actually think, as in that earlier picture, they can actually deploy their activities somewhat beyond what their charter, what their original assignment told them to do, but it's usually relatively close to the extant knowledge and skills that you already have. Because so people can't just, employees in general, except even R&D people, they can't just move from one type of knowledge to another domain set. So you can do innovative things, but relatively close to what you were doing. If you want really to explore completely new things, just human resources slack will not do it. So you will need kind of a whole kind of structural set of things. For example, in many large firms, we have new venture divisions. And so in other words, when head office says, well, if we're really serious about this new business, we have to take it outside of the existing businesses and kind of try to create something brand new. So it's much more than, of course, than human resources slack. But that is, in a sense, the first hypothesis here of the paper that is at the bottom there. Human resources slack is likely to lead to more entrepreneurial activities closely related to extant knowledge and skills rather than to pure exploration. But we expect there to be a positive relationship. Then we have financial slack. So financial slack simply means, just like the picture suggests, we just put more money into the subsidiary. And of course, what is good about money is that money is generic. It's unlimitedly absorbable across the firm's operation. Just give money to a subsidiary and somehow you can be sure it will be absorbed. What the literature suggests is, yes, you need actually some cash too to have subsidiary initiatives. But what we often find is in the literature is what I would call this inverted U-curve, which means you give more financial slack, the subsidiary initiatives go up, but there is a limit actually. There's a limit at which actually more money is detrimental to subsidiary initiatives because everything is too easy now, right? So you basically have all these excess resources and you become complacent. You don't feel that you have to innovate, that you have to do new things. Now, we thought about this carefully in the context of China, and so what we actually decided, it wasn't a hypothesis, was something that was slightly different though, because we thought, well, also knowing the companies that were, Canadian companies that were involved there, we assumed that the usage of financial slack was going to be monitored very closely by the corporate head office. Because imagine that you have set up a subsidiary in China, and it's really meant to be an export platform and to follow the technical specs very closely. And now you say, well, we'd like a subsidiary to do something more, and we're going to give cash for that. But at the same time, it's a bit that schizophrenic perspective. You want to keep a very close tap on that because you don't want that to be used for bribery purposes or for all kind of things that the money was not meant for. You don't have the trust really at the macro level in the culture that money will be well spent. And that may be a completely wrong perspective. I will come back to that. But I think that's kind of a bit of prevailing perception. So our hypothesis was that financial slack at a subsidiary level would not have an impact on subsidiary initiatives. It would not basically lead to more innovation in the subsidiary. Then we have the potential slack. So potential slack, as in the picture, how much can I borrow? So it's not that the headquarters say, here is the money, but it basically says, you have some discretion. You can open credit lines. We're willing to give a loan guarantee. We're willing to do things for you. You have to do it yourself as a subsidiary, but we basically, literally give you slack. So it's resources that a firm does not currently control, but can access if so desired, like the use of debt financing. And our hypothesis there, similar to the previous hypothesis with respect to giving money to the subsidiary, is again that will not have an impact on subsidiary initiatives, because again, our assumption is that the corporate head office will have a little bit of a schizophrenic perspective. On the one hand, yeah, we want to give them we want to allow them to borrow money, but at the same time, we really want to know exactly what they're going to do with that money, because China is not Germany or it's not France, and again, maybe completely wrong perspective, but certainly something that we thought we observed in firms. What then about the link between slack and subsidiary capabilities, and then slack and environmental factors? Well, it is clear that in the cases that we looked at Canadian firms, in the emerging economy context, that in most cases, indeed, in a first stage, there were some capabilities transferred from the home country, so from Canada, like advanced routines for cost-effective production, according to strict head office guidelines. But then the literature says, well, on the one hand, if you then have all that knowledge from the parent company, that may actually encourage experimentation. But there is also a counter view, which is that it actually may hinder experimentation because of perceived risks. So, yeah, we've transferred these capabilities to you, but it's about quality control. It's about maintaining precisely the specs, and we don't want you to dominate from these dominant routines. So here again, there is this kind of, it's unclear what the impact will be. And our hypothesis there was that actually we assumed that there would be a neutral association between or neutral impact of those subsidiary capabilities on what we expect it to be a positive impact, a positive association between human resources slack and subsidiary initiatives. So to rephrase this, so we think that if you have more people with free time, if you want, to develop initiatives, that there will be more initiatives, but it's not then because you have stronger capabilities in the sense of, you're really great at R&D, it's world class. That in itself will not amplify that effect of human resources slack. So whether you have very simple technologies or very complex technologies, whether you are a world leader in branding or not, that will ultimately not determine whether you will be successful in China with new initiative. But of course, we'll see then empirically which of these things, kind of pans out to be correct, a correct prediction or not. Then there's this idea of dynamism, industry dynamism. Of course, China is just like Canada, has a variety of industries. Some industries are fast growing, a lot of innovation, others not at all. And so we think that also dynamism, so the rate of change in innovation in industry, as well as uncertainty and unpredictability of the actions of competitors and customers, that may also perhaps have an impact on subsidiary initiatives. Now, we think it's kind of a pull force, because if all these things happen in industry, it draws the attention, of course, of the subsidiary managers in China. And we would assume then that if there is some human resources slack, that they would be more willing to deploy that towards initiatives that are in line, that are consistent with these changing conditions in industry. So the hypothesis here is that a more dynamic host country environment will amplify the positive association between human resources slack and subsidiary initiatives. With respect to then hostile environments, as I mentioned, so you have these direct competitors that really do the same thing as you. Well, prior empirical work has somewhat inconsistent findings. It's not entirely clear. There's some research that suggests more hostility leads to more innovation. There's other research that suggests, well, perhaps not. And so what we basically predicted was that in China, to the extent that you are in a truly threatening environment, so with a lot of competitors who are perhaps even better than you, you may as a manager use that human resource slack as a reserve that you will deploy only when a crisis occurs. That's perhaps also a little bit the Chinese way of doing things, that you have this reserve, but you're not going to use it for opportunistic initiatives. You're going to be careful and only deploy it when it's really required. So here again, we had kind of a hypothesis that a more hostile host country environment will have a neutral effect on what we expect to be a positive association between human resources slack and subsidiary initiatives. Okay, now after all these words, let's look at what we actually did. So what we did was a field visit survey. So there were really face-to-face interviews, in most cases done with senior management in Chinese subsidiaries. There was a questionnaire that was handed over to them, but that was then complemented with open-ended question on each Canadian subsidiary's capabilities. So there was, as you can see here on the left-hand side, there was a survey, and on the right-hand side, there was then really kind of, the answering of the open-ended questions, kind of in conversations that could last up to 4 hours. Mainly subsidiaries in Eastern China, Beijing, Shanghai, but that also included, for example, in Beijing, some companies, head offices of mining companies that operated in Western China, even close to the Mongolian border. So we started with a database of 146 subsidiaries of Canadian MNEs. We identified those from a database that we compiled from the Canada China Business Council, and then supplemented by a list of foreign invested enterprises compiled by the Ministry of Foreign Trade and Economic Cooperation. That number is, of course, much lower than the actual number of Canadian firms doing business in some form in China. That is now, according to the Asia Pacific Foundation's last report, higher than 600. But these are all firms that really have kind of an established presence and that really have, kind of employees, whether in the context of a joint venture or a wholly owned subsidiary. The actual empirical work was completed in 2008, and it was really a two-stage process. So Wen Long actually did kind of, two kind of multi-month visits in China. So now, in order to get the right person to be the respondent, because you know what happens with these questionnaires, the problem is, I mean, it's not difficult to have a questionnaire filled out, but who fills it out? Who completes it? Is it the CEO or is it the secretary? So you of course want people who are really knowledgeable to participate in this process, especially in the context of face-to-face interviews. And so in order to get those people, we first contact the senior managers at Canadian head office and ask them to identify who would be the best informant to basically, you know, help us to find the most relevant manager in the Chinese affiliate. So we got, at the end of the day, 74 subsidiaries that were willing to participate. And then in the end, there were really kind of, you know, 66 that were really useful, that, you know, they had to fill out the questionnaire completely. There were long face-to-face interviews. And then we applied hierarchical regression analysis to the data. Now, that is not important for this talk. What that simply means, hierarchical regression analysis, is that you don't want just your hypothesis to be shown to be statistically significant. Ultimately, you can find to be anything statistically significant. In hierarchical regression, you first put in control variables, so things actually that you don't want to study, but you have asked questions about those anyway, and you see to what extent they lead to some explanation, to what extent they help to explain subsidiary initiatives, and only then do you go to your actual main parameters, your main independent variables, and then in the third stage, you look at interaction effects. So, and we had quite a nice set of subsidiaries. There were a few companies that we would have liked, like the banks, like Royal Bank and like Bank of Montreal. We didn't get those, but we got, for example, the big Bombardier joint venture, Manulife, Sun Life, Nortel, construction company called Royal Group, a number of energy companies, Robertson. I mean, we got quite a nice group across industries, both manufacturing and services. So the dependent variable is, of course, besides that subsidiary entrepreneurship. This is something that we didn't invent. That is kind of a compound parameter, basically, that has been used in a number of papers in literature, and that I think is also very close to managerial practice. And we basically asked people, so these managers in the subsidiaries, to rank us these 6 items on a 10-point scale, going from strongly disagree to strongly agree. So to what extent have there been any new products developed in China by your operation and sold internationally? To what extent have you have had successful bids for corporate investments in China? To what extent have you engaged in new international business activities, but that first started in China? To what extent, and that's, I guess, the biggest one, have there been enhancements to the existing product lines that were already sold internationally? To what extent are there new corporate investments in R&D or manufacturing that were attracted by management in the Chinese subsidiary? And then finally, this in the end we eliminated for statistical reasons. We also had proposals to transfer manufacturing to China from elsewhere in the multinational firm. But that appeared kind of not to have any significance and to kind of to mess up the data. So at the end, we dropped that 6th element there. So then we come to the independent variables. So that is really what we tried to investigate. Do these things have any explanatory power? And again, I should also mention, I'm just trying to explain what is in the questionnaire, but all these things were then later in the interview validated, or kind of, there was a possibility to actually change the score. So it was not just someone filling out scores and, this is it, and let's now run this through the statistical analysis. So we feel quite confident that what we came up with in the end that is statistically significant, that is actually very close to managerial reality. So human resources slack, I already mentioned that. What would be the expected effect? Again, on a 10-point scale, going from output will not be affected to a 20-point drop. On subsidiary performance, if 10% of the time of all people working in a subsidiary had to be spent on work totally unconnected with their current tasks and responsibilities. So they really do things that, can be innovative. Financial slack, same approach, but here the question was, well, if your annual budget were reduced by 10%, what would you still be able to do? And then potential slack, the extent to which the subsidiary has easy access to resource for expansion by seeking help from the head office in terms of borrowing funds, renting resources, etc. And then finally, subsidiary capabilities. We asked whether the subsidiary had anything that was really distinctive expertise vis-a-vis other affiliates in the firm. Is there really something unique, something that the other affiliates in the firm, whether in Canada or elsewhere in the world of this firm, don't have? And we made a distinction between upstream and downstream. Because obviously, you may be weak at the downstream end in marketing, but you may be strong in upstream elements, sourcing, product and process R&D, manufacturing, managing international activities. And then we had several control variables from the literature that I don't want to bother you with, but I just mentioned one because that appeared to have some significance. That was subsidiary autonomy. And I think that is not so surprising. When subsidiaries have more autonomy, it's not surprising that, although it was not the scope of the research, but if you have a little bit of a free hand, it's obvious that it is easier to actually then deploy some subsidiary initiatives. Okay, let me come to the findings then and the discussion. So indeed, what we observed was that in China, those subsidiaries that have more human resources slack, that they also show more subsidiary entrepreneurship. So when you think again about all these nice things, developing new product lines, starting to export yourself, even though it was not in your charter, etc. That appears to be true. One example of that is like a Calgary-based company called Sunwing Energy that operates, I think, gold and copper mines and so on. And the general manager in the field had a lot of autonomy. And they were really able to develop new kind of business-government relations to smoothen operations, basically. So they really deviated from the script largely. So it's not conventional improvement of products and services, but they had to be entrepreneurial to actually work effectively. They had to deviate from the Canadian script, and they were able to be very successful there. But you also had companies where that was not the case at all. A company like Sun Life, where even the advertising strategy was decided at a regional level outside of China. You think of another firm like Robertson, for example, the firm that makes screws and screwdrivers. There, the subsidiary was a pure export platform, and so basically there was absolutely no slack whatsoever, right? So it was completely efficiency-driven, completely cost-driven operation. More financial slack is not associated with a higher level of subsidiary entrepreneurship. So those who have more money, who indeed have some reserve, that does not lead to higher subsidiary entrepreneurship at all. Then potential slack, so this ability to borrow funds, to have access to credit lines, doesn't seem to have any impact at all on entrepreneurship. Stronger, that is, I think, to me, the most interesting one in terms of contribution to the literature. But that's perhaps also the one of the elements that has a lot of managerial implications. It's not because you have stronger subsidiary capabilities that will amplify that impact of human resources slack. So in other words, in Canada, also at universities, we like to use the words excellence and world-class and so on. But really what I think in all these firms you don't necessarily need is world-class technology, world-class this or world-class that. What you need is, of course, a proven product technology or a proven service that is providing value added to the customer. And apart from that, you just need to have individuals who have some spare time to think about how they can recombine that, extend that, do new things with that in the Chinese environment. But you don't need to be world-class in China to be successful, whatever world-class means. We see that a more dynamic industry environment in China amplifies the positive association between human resources slack and subsidiary initiatives. And here I should basically show some humility when we say, of course, dynamic industry environment. We did not do an industry analysis. So these are industries that we characterize as being with high dynamism, like security services. By that is meant actually control systems in manufacturing. So it doesn't mean securities in a financial sense. It doesn't mean security like, Blackwater, kind of security services provided to individuals. It means basically control systems in manufacturing to make them more secure, to make them more reliable. Mining, computers, clothing, pharmaceuticals, beer. So we did not do an objective analysis of that, but it's the managers themselves who said, well, we really have these very close competitors, and we really have to be on our toes. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, or more firms that really do almost the same thing as what we do. And that's a kind of a high dynamism environment. We have suppliers who are dynamic. We have customers who are demanding, etc. And then there's, of course, low dynamism environments where basically there were not these cluster type effects. So in other words, the Canadian firms here had very specific niches in China, and they did not feel that the environment itself was pushing them to be innovative. Plastics, chemicals, engineering services, consulting, and then most other manufacturing. Again, this is kind of the perception of the managers themselves. But what we do see is if the perception is one of high dynamism, and perhaps perception is here more important than industry reality, because it's the perception that, of course, will drive what a subsidiary manager will do, then you see it amplifies that positive effect of human resources slack on, let's try to develop subsidiary initiatives. As we expected, and here again, with respect to industry hostility, that had actually no impact on, what did I miss that? Yeah, that had no impact on subsidiary initiatives. So it's clear that different types of slack function in an idiosyncratic function in the MNE context, whereas in developed economies, past research suggests, yes, more money, more potential slack, that will be helpful. In China, it's not helpful. The only thing that is really helpful is human resources slack. And so the managerial implication may be then that allocating more resources across the board to subsidiaries in China does not necessarily promote entrepreneurship. It's the nature of the slack that counts, and the focus should be on human resources slack. Then that linkage, as I already mentioned, with capabilities, really the strength, that idea of world-class is also lacking. And the reason is probably precisely the nature of China as an emerging economy. So this is not Silicon Valley, obviously. So strong upstream or downstream capabilities held by the subsidiary, even in the presence of some slack, do not imply that the subsidiary will be allowed by the head office to engage in new subsidiary initiatives. On the contrary, strong capabilities were often viewed by the head office as instrumental to manufacturing cost efficiencies, not as a rationale for subsidiary initiatives. So in other words, what it means is you have a strong capability. It means you are kind of a cost leader in the company, or you are kind of, yes, from that perspective, you're very good, but don't think that you can start anything else. Environmental factors did appear to be important, as I mentioned, that industry dynamism. But as I mentioned, that is kind of a little bit of a convoluted sentence there on the overheads. Subsidiary initiatives are locally embedded in the host country environment and pad dependent upon the subsidiary's earlier technological endowment trajectory. That's a lot of difficult words, but so I think what that really means is that there is a kind of a, as I already mentioned, kind of a schizophrenia in the minds of many managers at the head office of Canadian companies. On the one hand, yeah, there is this wonderful macroeconomic growth, we want that. And on the other hand, there's only one idea, control of our operation. And I think that both don't really go hand in hand if you want to be entrepreneurial. So I think that some of the stories that we heard show often an exaggerated kind of focus on control, with some subsidiaries that can't even bring out their own news releases. I mean, they do manufacturing, they can't even bring out their own news releases. It's done by a regional office outside of China. What we do think is important in that context, although that was not the focus of the study, is a stable management team. You have many cases of firms where the CEO changes, of the subsidiary changes every year, and that's the worst possible thing. because then you precisely miss that possibility to establish that rapport between the subsidiary and the headquarters and to build, I don't like to use the words, but I'll use it anyway, to build these relationships of trust between the head office and the subsidiary. And so that stable management team is critical. And we also see non-Canadian firms, like for example Dell in China. Dell had for several years between late 90s and 2004 almost every year a new CEO. And it basically went nowhere in that period. So you really need that stable management team precisely to reduce that kind of excessive focus on control. And then my last point that I want to make here is the link with the macro picture. As I said, I study what firms do, not really the macro picture. But what is interesting is we see now a growing interest in India, of course, and investment resources are scarce in this era still of the global crisis. And so the question then is, well, perhaps there is a lot of interest in China because there is a lower perceived need of having to control. In the main language in India is obviously business is English. There seem to be, although I'm not sure that the distance is actually lower institutionally and culturally, but it's certainly perceived to be much lower. And you just wonder then what governments can do to actually, not to make sure there is no investment in China, in India, but to make sure that still that Chinese-Canadian relationship is allowed to grow, and the Chinese environment perhaps becomes more hospitable to subsidiaries from Canada. So it is clear that something has to be done on that front. So how do you actually reduce that psychological tendency to think, we have to control, we need to know every single thing that Chinese subsidiary does every single day, a kind of a tendency that you don't have, as I mentioned, with an American subsidiary or a subsidiary in Germany. So how can we actually, by perhaps doing things at the macro level, how can we reduce that, I think, exaggerated propensity towards control? Finally then, and then I'll stop, of course, generalizability. I think that this is probably a kind of a quite correct picture of Canadian subsidiaries in China, whether it's kind of, it can be extended to other countries. I'm not sure, as I already mentioned. I think that this issue of control is very important here. For future research, I think that with respect to entrepreneurship, there's a lot of work that can be done on precise that interaction between slack on the one hand, the quality of resources, and then the actual uniqueness of resources, the capabilities. And one thing that we have not explored here is precisely the link between exploitative initiatives versus the real explorative initiatives. So when we talked about subsidiary initiatives here, it was in virtually 100% of the cases, it was really extending things that already existed. But as we all know, many subsidiaries nowadays of large multinational firms are supposed to explore, really do fundamentally new things. It is very clear that Canadian firms in China are not ready to even start contemplating that. I mean, it would be wonderful if there could be more exploitative initiatives, so more extensions of existing things that the firm is doing. But certainly in the long run, it will require a quantum leap. But what would it take to move more towards that exploration and really trying to develop products and services specifically geared towards the Chinese market? So thank you very much for your kind attention.
First question I have several questions. Wonderful. When human resources slack, are you talking about the expat slack in the part of the expatriates, or locals, or for instance the engineers, or just questionnaire question?
But really what happened during the interview was, I think that all the managers understood that people who have something in them, in the subsidiary, people who have something in them that could somehow be used for purposes of innovation. Basically, do they have time to engage in those activities? So I understand your question, you're very specific. Is it indeed expatriates, is it that category of people? The question was phrased as it could be anyone, but the understanding of the managers was people who have it in them. But it's so not necessarily expatriates only, not necessarily people at the top lines of management only. It could be people on the floor, but people from whom you could reasonably expect that actually, given their job characteristics and their own educational qualifications, they could, and their own ambition perhaps, they could do something if they were just given the time to do so.
So this is the people who actually filled out the questionnaire.
So the person who has the questionnaire is typically the CEO or a very senior vice president. Really the person who is best positioned to actually answer the questions about, what about the subsidiary capabilities. So the question is asked, so if you were, let's say, a CEO, the question would be asked to you, and the question would be very generic, people in general in the firm. But in fact, your understanding would be, not just filling out the questionnaire, but seeing Wen Long in front of you, your understanding would be anyone who can contribute anything in terms of innovation, whether in R&D, marketing, kind of any production activity, but who could do things that would deviate from the specs. Sorry. Yeah.
Thank you for your wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
I'm interested in the pedagogical aspects of the language. Did you have a response in French and English? How did you go about with the translation? Do you have some methodological challenges in the translation?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. So as I said, a person who did the empirical work in China was Wen Long. Wen Long was my former PhD student. Wen Long actually was Chinese born, so Chinese native, and he basically, his first degree was from a Chinese university in technical English. And so basically, I've worked with him for many years, and we've done enough questionnaires together, and so I make sure that it's actually in English the way I like it, and then he basically has the translation, and then he, of course, kind of submits the questionnaire in the language that it's supposed to be, and he speaks, then the follow-up questions are in the language, depending upon who the CEO or the senior vice president is. So, I understand fully the kind of the complexity, in fact, embedded in your question, but I think that from a methodological perspective, the problems were limited here simply because of the nature of the interviewer, and also at the moment when interviews were done, Wen Long was already actually also a Canadian citizen. So it was really, when it was talking with a Canadian, it was that Canadian rapport, and when it was talking with really kind of a native Chinese person who had never actually been in Canada, except for some meetings, there was also the rapport. So it was not a problem here. But I understand the question, yeah.
I'm wondering, after you've linked
to your dependent variable is more entrepreneurship. Now, once we have more entrepreneurship in these subsidiaries, are they also higher performing? Do we link this to increase market share, increase sales revenue, increase such things as well?
I think a wonderful question, and I refer to kind of this recent survey of the Asia Pacific Foundation, which suggests that 75% of subsidiaries or operations in China are profitable. I always wonder, well, why are the other 25% still there? But I think it's a very good question, because I think it's this kind of, so we did not study this, but it's kind of this leap of faith, kind of, will subsidiary initiatives actually lead to a better performing firm? Number one, a better performing subsidiary. Number two, a better performing firm overall. And I think that many gurus in management, like for example the INSEAD professors, those Santos and Williamson, who wrote this book a few years ago, the Multinational, that they go completely overboard. Their view is, if we can just innovate in all these peripheral places and learn from the world, we'll have a much higher performing firm. And I have big doubts about that. So I'm very skeptical, and I'm also very worried even about a firm like General Electric. General Electric is now seemingly going on that path, and I have no problem with General Electric having enormous operations in China and in India. I think that's wonderful. But this idea that somehow innovation can come from there, and that you can somehow divorce it from your main product lines, I think that's very tricky, and that's I think where the problem is, right? So I like subsidiary initiatives. I like to see them as mainstream product lines that have proven potential, proven profitability, and I don't like to think of subsidiary initiatives as really a substitute, because I think, the product lines that represent 95% of your cash flow, you have to respect them. And I think the problem with much of the guru talk nowadays is that, like those Santos and Williamson call those harvesters. The CEOs of the main production operations, the main production, they're just harvesters. They don't bring anything. They're just like, and I just think, well, wait a minute. It's actually not easy to have production efficiencies. It's actually not easy to have quality controls, as we also know from universities. It's not easy to respect specs. So you need to show sufficient respect to that and not go overboard. So I like to believe on the one hand in terms of, let 1,000 flowers bloom. But then I think relatively quickly you have to say, well, this makes sense and this actually doesn't. So I understand your question. So no, the answer is no. It is not clear at this point at all that the subsidiary is now in with one exception, that is that, but that's not really, that's borderline initiative. Just national responsiveness to me is not really initiative. It means, okay, you're allowed to adapt, and if you don't adapt, like we've seen in some of the insurance companies and so on, well, you better leave the country, which then they often do after a few years. So you need to be able to engage in national responsiveness. But that's not quite the same thing. That kind of incremental adaptation is not quite the same thing as the way we understand subsidiary initiatives, where there is really this entrepreneurial spirit and really something fundamentally new, something proactive rather than just reactive. And the jury is out, in China at least. The jury is not out, I think, in general. I think overall you want subsidiaries to show some initiative and to, and also at the end of the day, of course, you reward or you punish as a function of performance that is achieved. But I think in China the jury is out, whether this is whether the time is ripe. But what I do know, what I'm 100% certain of, is that the control function is too strong at this moment for the average Canadian company. There is too much control. There is, and again, I really don't like the word trust, because trust to me has all these connotations about, an untrustworthy culture, an untrustworthy society, which I think is inappropriate. But I think that for the moment there is certainly a kind of that distrust which has to be fixed. And if you don't fix that, you will have little more than export platforms and firms that indeed just produce garbage bags or bags for for coal and so on that are then shipped back to Canada. And is that really what Canada-China relationships are all about? Perhaps they are, but.
So how did you deal with problem bias? Because I've worked in a large institution, I've seen senior management fill in surveys like this, and I wondered if they were in the same institution.
Yeah, that's a very good question. I get lots of papers. I don't write those papers anymore nowadays with single survey, single respondents, because you can't get that stuff published anymore in journals. So. But having said that, in this particular case, I feel relatively confident, because for each of these subsidiaries there was also background research done. When I do these types of papers, I always make sure that we look at the yellow reports, that we try to look at the financial data and so on. So I completely agree with you. I think methodologically there is a problem with that, and certainly if there were no face-to-face interview, if there was not a follow-up open-ended question, if there was not a prior research done on the companies themselves, almost like mini case studies on every subsidiary, I would be extremely worried. In this case, I'm not too worried, but I agree with you. If it's easy for me to say it in a paper. Actually, I do say that in the paper, but the moment that a reviewer gets it from a journal, irrespective of whether it's a journal or whether it's used, as kind of having listened to the talk, this is a genuine constraint of the research. And you're right, if we had been able to talk to 5 different people in every subsidiary, we undoubtedly would have had a richer picture. But I do not think in this particular case that there is too much embellishment, because when you actually look at the narratives of some of these conversations that took place, and that is also why I can't really have a list of the companies, saying exactly, I could mention a few, but I can't have a list, but some of these things were actually not always very, complimentary of the head office. So, the people in China, the managers there, they were of course promised confidentiality, and so they were often willing to actually say relatively critical things. But your point is well taken. So it's certainly a limitation of the research.
Alain, thank you. I had a PhD student doing similar type of work. She was interested in interviewing small companies in China. And her story was problem. So it was sort of a smaller firm, but the CEO was like the picture in the top half, totally engulfed. I wonder if you could say something about the descriptive statistics of your sample. You must have had a range of companies.
Yes, you're right. And we have very large companies. It's a very good question. I have to look for very quickly to at least show you the range. So it was the sample was biased towards larger companies, but we had some small ones too, simply because they were very eager to participate. So let me just see to give you the exact answer. Where are you? My apologies, I think I have it here. Okay, so yes, so the largest Canadian subsidiary, and there were a number of those, had more than 5,000 workers in China, and then there were 29 that have, they had several dozen employees, but lower than 100. So I would not call them small, but certainly medium-sized. So you had everything from, let's say, 60 employees up to 5,000. And I should also mention, because that is also relevant in the context of your question, that the subsidiaries have been operating an average of almost 8 years in China, but few more than 15 years for obvious reasons. So, but the point is that, so there were few complete novices in the, which is probably what your doctoral student is actually studying, firms that have just established a foothold there, that have been there for 2 or 3 years. And so these are already more experienced companies in China itself.
Could you estimate the percentage that self-identified as being innovative? Is it high or small?
Small, much smaller than in conventional samples. So if you think of that, I don't know if that table is there, but if you think of 1 to 10 in terms of and then of course you have this compound scale with the 5 or 6 sub variables. You would expect the average or the median to be somewhere at 5, and here it was substantially below that. So I think, and that of course is also in line with the results that I described, that people feel they just can't do it. But I think the difference in the story here, as compared to the mainstream story that you've probably heard a dozen times, explained by others who are much more knowledgeable than I am, is most of the time it's about government this and government that. And that's all true, of course. But here the storyline is, in government probably can, various government levels can fix a number of things. But here the storyline is really that there is also a problem mentally in the head offices, in the in this case, Canadian multinational firms. And we should not underestimate that. We have to work on, how can we fix that? How can we change that mental, just like we had several decades ago after World War II. Well, what's the stuff that came from Japan was just real crap, right? And how our mindsets have evolved. When you think about the automobile industry or the electronics industry, our mindsets have not just evolved, we've done a 180-degree turn. And I think here we need, I'm not saying we need a 180-degree turn, but we need probably a turn of a few notches in terms of this idea, not trustworthy, needs control 24 hours a day. We need to change that. Looking on the one hand at American affiliates in Canada and then European ones, and see if NAFTA had influenced them differently. And what was interesting was to see that, and perhaps NAFTA is only a kind of a part of the story here, but the American subsidiaries in Canada, they basically had much stronger capabilities as perceived by their own CEOs and their own top managers as compared to the European ones. And we had basically firms participating, like Total, in Calgary. Total, kind of one of the biggest oil companies in the world, Siemens and so on. It was really interesting to see that even these gigantic multinational firms, they felt that their level of capabilities in some areas that they were much weaker. And not so much in terms of upstream or even production, but primarily in the area of downstream activities, so everything that has to do with marketing, branding, and everything that has to do with government relationships and so on. They felt much weaker, which is interesting because when you think of some industries as global industries like oil or like some parts of electronics, especially the types of electronics that Siemens is in, you would think, how can they encounter problems in Canada as compared to equivalent American firms, but they do. And so that is certainly something that we observed, that many managers of Canadian affiliates found themselves to be at a weaker position as compared to Asian rivals also operating in China. And again, whether that is perception is kind of, a reflection of reality, or whether it's just something that they feel deeply inside, it's always with this type of research that's difficult to figure out. But certainly that is the similarity. What the difference is, though, is that when you now talk to subsidiaries in Canada in general, they feel actually that they can innovate, that there is a lot of potential, that is all the idea of the miniature replicas in Canada, and kind of just these little, subsidiaries that are meaningless, that are just here to do some small-scale production for the market. I think that that has largely left the mind of managers, but that is certainly very much alive in China. So this idea that, we're just here to implement, and really we can't do much. We just don't have the human resources slack. I don't know if that's an answer to your question, actually, but may I ask you, given that you were there for quite a long time, working actually for multinational firms, is any of this does it ring a familiar bell, or is your experience, that is a long experience of 12 years, I think you said, is your experience completely different?
I didn't think from this academic angle, but two observations I could share with you. And that's several years ago. One is Canadian companies typically pay expats very poorly. So you see Canadian expats not working for Canadian companies. You see Canadian expats all over the place, but not necessarily working for Canadian companies. And that's well known. Working for Canadian companies is not a cool thing as far as competition is concerned. Second is parent companies have a very heavy sort of trader mentality. This is because Canadian economy is resource-based. We dig up and we sell, and that's the end of it. So in terms of long-term commitment, in terms of initial losses, realistic projection of the market, it's a huge battle between the people in the field and the head office. And usually the result would be sometimes would be quite tragic. They fold up the tent and come home. So there are cases, numerous cases like that.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting insight, actually, that it may be, in a sense, the Canadian business,
which is a resource-based culture, that may actually also then prevent subsidiaries from being very innovative, because the idea is, well, here are resources and you do something with them, but there is without having that next leap. Yeah, that's very interesting. I hadn't thought of that. Thank you.
I assume that the CEOs very senior managers that were interviewed in the study, that there would be a mix of, let's say, white Caucasians and ethnic Chinese. So did the ethnicity of the respondent make a difference, because you're looking at perceptual measures?
no, the sample was also too small to come. We tried that, and we also tried to make a distinction, which of course is very important to get this published in an academic journal, between
subsidiaries, but nothing came out of it that was statistically significant, no. So I think there may be, but I think that the study didn't, if we had more data, perhaps, when you get to this type of sample size. And again, when you think about the Canadian managers, these Canadian-born managers was really only, it was not 1/3, of course, because there are a few who are non-Chinese and non-Canadian who were also in the sample. So it's close to 25% of 66, that is little. But I think that's a great question, and yeah.
Consider the presence or absence of protection for intellectual property.
yeah.
Yeah, I think that is certainly something that explains, so it was not a question in the questionnaire, but it's certainly something that explains, I think, this idea of willing to control, this idea that, also the observation that neither the financial slack nor the potential slack has any positive impact. I think that all has to do with this perception that that intellectual property is not going to be protected in China. I think that is certainly, and that lives very strongly in the minds of managers, absolutely. So in other words, but not in their own minds, but so the way they perceive it is, yeah, we are not trusted by the head office because we have to work in an environment where there is in fact a lot of difficulty with contract enforcement and a lot of difficulty with intellectual property right protection. That's a big part of the story, and that's, I think, also precisely the linkage with the macro level picture, of course, right? That is the way that governments can at various levels, but can try to actually create a shift in perception by somehow giving signals, yeah, we're, contract enforcement, no problem. Yeah, access to the WTO is not just, kind of some mirages, some kind of lip service. It's, we're also serious about intellectual property rights protection. So, but I think there's a long way to go perceptually to convince people in Canada that something is happening on that front.
Thank you. We just mentioned the joint ventures there. So you weren't able to find the sample was too small to kind of tell the difference between the two?
Oh no, we know, of course, for every operation what the
joint venture. We know, but we cannot distinguish in terms of, whether joint ventures have, for example, more capability to do, because you see that would be the expectation, right? The expectation would be that if you have, so the sample is split about 50-50. So you would expect that actually joint ventures would be somewhat more entrepreneurial, because why did you have a joint venture partner in the first place? In many cases, it's not because they have great technology, it's because basically they know the Chinese environment. And so you would expect them then that the partner to give signals in the joint venture, this is how you have to adapt, this is how you have to do things differently. So you would expect actually a positive impact on subsidiary initiatives, but the statistics don't show any of that. Neither do the interviews, so there is nothing that comes out, which was a surprise to us. But again, it's more than just, it's not because, to me, it's, of course, statistical significance is important, but it's also not born out of the interviews. It's not that people who were running a joint venture said, oh yeah, we can do lots of, perhaps it's even the contrary, because as you know, when you have a joint venture partner, perhaps you even want to control even more what is happening in the operation. You really want to know how every single dollar is spent in that joint venture operation. But was that your question, or kind of, yeah?
The research are only linked to China, or could it be easily transferred to India, perhaps, or to Korea, or some other developing Asian countries?
I think that basically it's research a type of research that can be easily expanded towards other emerging economies that are at a high distance. To me, I think what is important is this issue of distance. And again, I don't necessarily believe in objective distance all that much, because as also Rosalie's work shows, kind of we talk about cultural distance between Canada and China, but in fact there is a very complex reality that underlies that. We have now all these expatriates. We have these expatriates who have basically spent a number of years in North America, a number of years in China. There is back and forth. I mean, there's a lot of complexity that is actually not captured in many studies. But I do think that at the end of the day, there is still, when you look at a large sample of firms in a country and you go to a high distance context, I think it's really this idea of, okay, what kind of capabilities will we transfer to that country? Is it going to be world class, or is it primarily, just for that local market on the one hand? And on the other hand, the idea of distance also, there is more distance, and therefore we need ultimately more control. And more control is not always we need 24-hour control. It just means that we need to have very, very stringent routines in terms of finance, accounting, etc. And so what, to me, the interesting question would be, if you then you would do the similar type of study in Korea, assuming that you have enough companies, and you would do the similar type of work in India, which I think is a self-evident case, and you could also do Brazil, for example. So you could do the BRIC basically, and then with Korea would also be interesting. It would be interesting to see how the mindset of the head office would be different vis-a-vis those, or would be the same as in the Chinese context. And my guess would be, but that's a pure guess, is that for Russia it would be the same mentality. We don't trust these guys. We need high control according to specs. And my impression from talking to a few managers who have gone to India is that there seems to be more lenience towards, for a number of obvious reasons, towards having operations in India. That there would be more, people would be more amenable to actually allow subsidiary initiatives there than they would in Russia or in China. but that it would be great research if that could be done, just covering the bricks, basically. That would be great.
Thank you for your presentation. I have a question about the environmental factors. You mentioned that amplifies the organizational factor. For a Canadian multinational enterprise, is that environmental factors in the long run, it will helps that company to do more, like to produce more service and product, or in the long run that's considered as a threat?
No, you see, what is interesting.
This is, of course, also, I think, a useful counterbalancing argument against the old neo-Marxist view of multinational firms, right? The old neo-Marxist view is you have a strong monopolistic advantage in Canada, you know, and so you're going to do something in China and you're going to basically exploit that monopolistic advantage, and you're going to make, you know, you're going to have rents in China. And the idea here is, well, that's not really how it works. So basically, if you want to do well, actually an environment where you have some competitors, where that is demanding customers, demanding suppliers, etc., that environment is actually going to be, in a sense, better for you. It will force you to innovate. It will force you in the long run to actually become a better firm. And that is, I think, also the whole, I mean, I don't believe that whole story, but I'll say I believe half of it, you know, the bottom of the pyramid type thinking. The bottom of the pyramid type thinking ultimately is not, it's not really about, you must understand, that's not the reason why C.K. Prahalad, who recently passed away, was so popular with managers and, you know, CEOs of large companies. It was not because he was talking about, you know, feeding the bottom X billion people at the, you know, at the pyramid. The reason why CEOs were attracted by it was because C.K. Prahalad was saying, you're going to be a better firm at the end of the day. So in other words, if you just go for the low-hanging fruit, which in this case is actually at the top of the pyramid, you know, the people who earn the high salaries in the developing and emerging economies, you know, this is not going to help you. You're just going to have, you're going to sell your, you know, your BMWs there and your high-level GE stuff, and that is not what you should do. That is not going to, but if you want to be a better firm, you know, more innovative firm, that is why you have to look at that bottom of the pyramids, because it will lead to business innovation. And I think it's a bit the same storyline here, right? So basically, if you really believe in the Chinese markets, you have to let these subsidiaries, to some extent at least, run like, you know, horses, you know, and let them be themselves rather than holding in those reins. Again, with all the qualifications that were mentioned here before, but you have to give them some slack. And you will be a better firm at the end of the day. And that, I think, is the message to management. If they, you know, if they can get that it's not just that the Chinese, that more stuff will happen in China, but that actually the firm itself is going to become a better firm. That's, if we can basically somehow transmit that message, then we have, I think, done a useful job.
I'm so interested about the vertical sector. You had this survey for the 74 company. What kind of vertical sector?
Oh, sectors were, so it really went from
services, as I said, with the exception of the two banks that we really wanted. But we had manufacturing, we had mining, so we had energy. So we really had kind of, it was an interesting cross-section actually about the same, you know, if you look at Canadian industry, it was about the same type of sectors. There were, you know, a few companies in foods, I mean, it was the whole cross-section really of Canadian industry. So it was not biased towards one particular sector. They were literally, that made, you can also say it's a weakness of the research, because sometimes if you do research in one sector, like if you do only resources or only energy, that may in itself also be valuable. But here I think we had a very good cross-section. And so it was not clear that there were actually any particular differences, like there was a big difference between services versus all the rest, that the answers were different. Actually, one thing that surprised me actually a little bit, because I normally like to think that when you're in services, that you actually have to be more nationally responsive and that you have to be a little bit more innovative to be successful, but that wasn't borne out of the data at all. So that perhaps also explains why there are some service companies that don't do all that well in China, because they are not sufficiently entrepreneurial. But that was a little bit of a surprise, yeah.
I can send it to you. I don't know if I know that there's a table, but I don't know if I have it actually in this version.
Let me just check. But that may be. No, that table is not in this version, but if you're interested, I can certainly send it to you. So that is absolutely no problem. But so it is just that, you know, I mean, we have a few drafts of the paper, but this draft for an academic journal doesn't have it, sorry.
You have quite a few null hypotheses in paper, so statistically it can be difficult to test.
Oh yeah, but we all, yeah, I know that. That's a very good question.
Hypothesis by hypothesis, we use partial models. We never test everything at the same time. So, I mean, that's one. I know. Exactly. So, and that's a big problem with this type of research. You see, I'm sorry, this is kind of an academic research question, but this is a very important question. You see, the journals now want, the top journals, they want to have, if possible, 300 respondents. They want multiple respondents for every firm. And what you see is basically, and I apologize for saying that, lots of what I would call, in French, des idiots savants. So you have these people who are very good at stats, and they do all these wonderful things. They have the 300 data points, they have all the multiple respondents, and at the end of the day, they have no idea what they're talking about. Because ultimately, it's because you can't do it. I mean, I had a guest speaker in Calgary a year ago, Ulf Andersson from the Copenhagen Business School. And he was talking about research that he did 10 years ago. And he did that. But you know how long that one research project, it took 3 years to do that research project. And I think there were 3 doctoral students, including himself then, who worked on that. And then you can do that. But now you expect that type of research from the individual doctoral student or the individual researcher. And that's why most of this research, even if it's published in AMJ, when you actually know, I mean, I have a colleague of mine in Calgary who won the, you know, he's really smart. He was at Wharton. He won the best paper award in AMJ. And he says much of the stuff that appears now, and that on the surface looks fantastically sophisticated, but actually people don't know the substance. Like his specialty is law firms, you know, in their international expansion and what, and he just looks at these papers that are being published, and he says, you know, these guys don't understand the underlying, you know, the underlying drivers of the firms, of the industry, etc. And so I think we have this great paradox that on the one hand, you know, we want to be managerially relevant, you know, as an academy of management or an academy of international business. But to be managerially relevant, you really need to talk to managers in depth. And, you know, and one interview with one senior manager may take ultimately, if you think in terms of days, to get that may, not the interview may be maximum 2 or 3 hours, but it may be a 3-day work to actually get that or more, to get that going. And so you want on the one hand managerial relevance and that type of stuff. And then at the same time, you want to have the multiple respondent. I mean, if you basically contact firms and you say, you know what, I would like to talk to 5 people in your company. I mean, how many answers do you think you're going to get? So there is something that is, in my view, and perhaps this is heresy, you know, but I'm saying here, but there is something artificial about many of these studies that actually have been, where that actually has been done, and where you don't see how it, where you don't understand how could they do that. I could, like Ulf Andersson's story understood. 3 doctoral students worked on that for a few years, and they got all the data, and they knew what they were talking about. And they you know, they talked to managers in Scandinavia. They went for months to the US to talk to managers there in subsidiaries. And they talk to people in the upstream operation, production, downstream operation. But it's extraordinarily difficult to get that done. And then at the end of the day, if I have to choose, I prefer to have 50 data points where I can do, at the end of the day, a factor analysis, and having all these little partial models, but where I know what I'm talking about, rather than, you know, these. Anyway, but that's my view, and I'm sorry. Perhaps I've probably kind of insulted people, but sorry, you got the question?
An open-ended speculative question that you already began to address just now, and that is, you did mention several times the conservative managerial style of Canadian companies and the controlling tendencies, and you contrasted that with, say, for example, Germany and the US. I'm wondering, here you are, an educator at a business school in Canada now, with a broad international perspective, and you're, well, I just wondered, do you think business schools in Canada right now are positioned, is there a culture such that we can be confident that the next generation or 2 of managers will have shifted, will have moved away from this conservative culture?
No, I don't think.
Why? I think that most people, so in business schools, for example, they're taught course in international business, and the books are written by Americans who talk about global. and they have no idea what global is. They don't understand how difficult actually it is to do business internationally. I think that's, so, and I think that ultimately almost when you're in business, in international business, it's almost forgetting what you see in the textbook that was written by your, but so I'm relatively skeptical, yeah, so. But so having said that, of course, Canadians are uniquely positioned to actually take advantage of that. So from that perspective, I'm hopeful. Okay. Yes.
Practical perspective, well, while you are collecting the data, the reason why there is some difference, because there is China also, there are particular reasons. It is very fast developing. And then is a cluster of the industrial cluster is really expanding. Yes. In case there are a lot of business, possibilities. For example, Chinese local companies are unable to make some quality materials and other things. So the company who already existed there, and they can see some kind of needs. Yes. So they can invite a company who they know, and otherwise they joined with some other local companies, and then they produce something. Yeah, so in case I think this, how can I say, hot areas, we can say, and then quite remote areas, if we compare with that, what kind of result you may expect?
Well, I think it's a very good question. So I think you've, in fact, already given the answer. I think that in terms of governance, what we'll see is a lot of venture capital projects, a lot of very sophisticated contracting arrangements, a lot of very sophisticated type of joint ventures, but not the conventional with 50-50 or 51-49, very complex contracting structures. That is obviously the future, because it's obvious that that is the only way, I think, that firms from North America or from Europe are going to be willing, perhaps, to, yes, let that subsidiary initiative, let's give it a chance, rather than just replicating what has already been developed in North America or in Europe, for example, or in Japan. So I think that, so you gave the answer. I think we're and that's, I think, very exciting to me. I think we're going to see very, very complex governance structures that we have not seen elsewhere. Precisely to, on the one hand, okay, we can mitigate control problems, and obviously it's clear that the conventional wholly owned subsidiary is not the right vehicle actually to allow subsidiary entrepreneurship. But we will only be able to actually capture those opportunities if we work with these local entrepreneurs, but then in kind of sophisticated ways, so that we overcome these issues of contract enforcement, intellectual property rights, theft, and so on. So from that perspective, I'm very, I wouldn't say hopeful, but I'm kind of very intrigued by what is going to come. The one danger, of course, and that's kind of the reverse investment that some people from Canada have also pointed at, is of course the problem of the investment coming out of China, and that is actually not bound by the rules of capitalism. So in other words, where you have very, very deep pockets where you can buy up resources, you can buy about anything you want, and ultimately you are not forced by the markets to actually make these operations efficient, or so, and that is, I think, that's a completely different problem, of course. But when you already see now, and I'm sorry to deviate to that topic, but the whole issue about potash in the prairie provinces, which in my view is nonsensical, right? I mean, potash is, it's like oil, right? I mean, the resource rights are held by government. Government makes some decision as to, royalties, etc. And frankly, whether it's, the founder of my business school, Dick Haskane, or someone in Australia who ultimately runs an efficient show, I'm not sure that I care too much about that. I mean, if a company is willing to pay $12 billion, or whatever the amount is, and inject in the Canadian economy, and if Canadian entrepreneurs then get those resources, they can do completely different things with that money if they're entrepreneurial. So I'm not too worried about that. But I am worried in a sense about state-owned enterprises with deep pockets who could come in and basically buy resources. And I think it's time to close.
Well, I'd just like to, on behalf of the David Lab Center, thank Professor Verbeke for a very engaging, interesting talk. And we have a token of thanks for you.
Thank you very much. It's very kind.
So, and thank you all for coming. Before I let you go, we have a film screening, independent documentary film with 2 Asian American filmmakers coming here for a forum. It's called Autumn Gem, and it's about a late 19th century Chinese Joan of Arc, a revolutionary during the Qing dynasty, a remarkable figure who's become a real hero in China since she passed away, since she was executed. So if you would like to come to that discussion, the details are on the website. Just Google David Lam Center. Thank you. Thanks again for coming.